All right, everybody, let's get started here. Thanks for coming here on a Friday afternoon. I know everybody's got flights and everything. My name is Matt Kemmelhar. I'm a director at Microsoft for our global incident response team. And Mark and I had a lot of fun putting this together because we used a lot of lessons from investigation type work to put this presentation together for you.
Yep. And my name is Mark Simos. I'm a lead architect in the same group as Matt, our enterprise cybersecurity group. And yeah, we did have a lot of fun putting this together. Security people have a different definition of fun than other people. Got a few laughs. Okay, we got a decent Friday crowd going. And so we're going to be talking about some very serious topics, but really helping you guys kind of understand the journey of securing Office 365 and what it looks like through a security lens, so that you can kind of be better prepared to secure your tenants and protect against the attacks that, quite frankly, Matt's team is dealing with on a very regular basis. So there's a couple different sessions on Office 365 security. We want to spend a moment here. At this point in the conference, they're recordings. Kind of what the attacks are is a focus of one of the sessions, so that we're not going to cover them in too much detail. We're going to mention the ones, but if you want to see the demos and the tools and how that goes, go check out the recording of that session. We're going to be talking about kind of the top priorities and the roadmap and how to approach this. That'll be this session that we're talking about today. How to measure progress using Secure Score. There's a great theater session on that to kind of go through the Secure Score stuff. We will be showing a little bit about Secure Score, but not in nearly as much depth. And then a session that I did yesterday is really about designing the end state. How do you actually, okay, I'm going to Office 365, how do I design the tenant completely? And we took a very extreme scenario of a political campaign, which is, for those that aren't familiar with it, a startup that lasts about 18 months and bankrupts itself after that 18 months. So it's a very unique, got to build it quick, may or may not have, long-term security teams type of extreme scenario. So we have that session as well to kind of look at this from a couple different lenses. So we're gonna do a two-part talk today. The first is we're going to talk about the end state. When you step down the timeline, at the end of it, you're on Office 365, what does it look like? What are the things you don't have to deal with anymore from a threat or a configuration perspective? And what is the stuff that's new or different or changed from what we've had to deal with on-premise? And then the second piece is really going to be focusing on the journey and how do you get to there? How do you get to that end state and avoid the mistakes that we've seen in the past? And how do you get the most bang for the buck and make sure you're investing in the right things first with your security efforts? Sound good? All right, see a few head nods, so we're good. So the first thing that we wanted to step back to, how many folks have seen a diagram like this about shared responsibility? Seeing at least half the hands. So just in brief, when you move to the cloud from on-premise, one of the first biggest things that you deal with that really frames out the world, and you'll see this reflected in the attacks, the configurations, the responsibilities, this really dominates everything about both your IT operations as well as security. There's some things that you are going to be in control of, your data, your workstations, your endpoints, all of those things you're still fully in control of in your IT department. From an IT, an operations, a productivity, a security perspective, those are all still your responsibilities to do day to day. There's some things at the bottom there in the gray that get transferred to the cloud provider. They're no longer your problem. You do not have to patch Office 365. You do not have to update the firmware of the servers that are running Office 365. Those are things that just that you don't have to deal with because they're the cloud providers, and then there's a variation in the middle. So looking at it through this model, we're going to kind of go through each of the things as you look at things when you're on Office 365 of what's different. So we're going to start with what's gone. What are the things that we simply don't have to do anymore? You don't have to patch Office 365 like you did Exchange. Can I get a yay? And software feature upgrades, you don't have to add things up. You don't have to apply service packs. It just gets done for you. Now, there is a little bit of some responsibility that comes with that because you have to keep up with that. We'll talk about that a little more later. But the fact is you don't have to install those anymore. It's just simply a configuration. Server maintenance and troubleshooting, not something you have to worry about. Server uptime. And by the way, when you look at the way we broke it down, you notice we're following the SAS column on the very left. And so server uptime, that's not your problem. You have an SLA from Microsoft that says this is how much you're going to get. And then backup, archive, you don't have to install all of those archival solutions that you used to. Everybody remember all those email archive solutions in Exchange and all the fun that they had? Yeah, so you don't have to worry about that because it's built into Exchange, it's built into Exchange and into a SharePoint and OneDrive as well.
Hey Mark, can I comment real quick too on the backup and archiving solutions? One of the interesting benefits too in the light of a lot of these ransomware cases and such that have gone on is we've had a lot of luck doing recovery type work by just using OneDrive and some of the features where they're doing incremental backups in OneDrive and SharePoint. So it wasn't an intended consequence of that, but it was really nice during ransomware to be able to get back some of the recent issues that have happened when most of customers' data was encrypted. So it was a nice benefit when you were doing backups.
Absolutely. And do you want to start covering the attacks?
Yeah, so a little bit also about some of the shared responsibility that you no longer have to deal with anymore is the denial of service attacks. So before, if you had an Exchange server or an OS server that was publicly accessible, it was your responsibility to handle some of the denial of service. That's now put on Microsoft to do that, so they spread it over a lot of different servers, and we've got capabilities to handle that. And then just physical attacks too, whether it's some sort of insider, whether it's old hardware or anything like that, that's all handled in our data centers. So that's not something that you have to worry about anymore from a traditional threat perspective. Also, we have to look at the operating system side of this house. I've done many incident responses, and I can tell you that it's not the application that they're going after, especially when you're talking about an Exchange compromise. It's typically the underlying operating system. And it's those old unpatched systems that you've got, that one 2003 Exchange server that was sitting out there that ends up being the issue that the attacker gets into. And then ultimately, they use that to parlay it into access into your emails. So that's just an issue that you don't have to handle, as well as things like patching your firmware and all that, which I'm sure we all do on a regular basis, right?
So how many people actually apply firmware updates to your servers for security reasons? I have about 5 or 6 hands out of about 100 people, so good on you, thank you. But it's not a very common practice. And one of the things I want to emphasize, when you think about operating system level attacks, just to give an example, one of the things that we're focusing on right now, and something I'm doing myself, is around what we're calling rapid cyber attacks, or rapid destruction attacks like WannaCrypt and Petya, or not Petya, actually, to be more accurate. That is really an operating system attack because it does operating system vulnerabilities and credential theft of admin credentials of the operating systems. And those are the two ways it propagates to threads. That's not something that you actually have to worry about for a workload like Office 365. In fact, some of the customers, they lost a lot of on-premise resource, very serious incident. But their Office 365 was up and running and available and ready to go, except the fact that they were federated and they couldn't actually log on from their on-premises AD. So it was a mix of good and bad. But that particular aspect of it, because the OS is not something you have to manage and worry about and patch, and it's not your responsibility for it, that gets done for you. So it's just something that comes along. So the other thing, and this is when I talk to organizations about going to the cloud and a security strategy, the number one thing, whether it's actually stated out loud or whether it's kind of understood, is that there isn't a firewall. When we as security people look at the world, especially coming from in the past, we've had one policy engine. We've had one place to apply policy. We've had one place to have control over what happens from a security perspective to manage that security and threat risk. And that's been the firewall. And when you talk about a software as a service application, there is no firewall. It's out there on the internet. It is a software as a service ready to go. So what does that mean specifically as we take a look at that? And then we'll talk a little bit about how the world is changing and evolving to it. So first of all, let's define this. There's two elements of interest when you talk about what is directly connected to the internet. And even though they're technically pretty much the same actual ports, protocols, et cetera, they have very different meaning and impact. The first is user services and interfaces. So things like going to your SharePoint site, going to your mailbox, all those kind of things. There is no firewall there. That's interesting, but the most interesting piece is the administrative interfaces. Because we used to be able to say, the only way to get to the Exchange server or the SharePoint server or what have you would be to log on from an on-premise machine that had access to it. And what was happening was you were behind a firewall. And behind a firewall in itself was one level of protection, but what it really meant is we had a baseline of protection. It was a managed machine, it was secured, it was patched, it had antivirus, it had all the security baseline stuff that made it okay, or made us feel okay that, you know what, we're at this baseline of security before we even start the administration authentication. We don't have that on the internet. Any host of any trust level can access those administrative interfaces. That is the important part of the change, and you'll see a lot of that in the roadmap of how do we compensate for that and how do we mitigate that same risk in a different way. So the implications of that, first and foremost, is authentication security is critical. Absolutely first, number one sets of recommendations that you'll see is all about getting that authentication security in place. You need the multi-factor authentication to make sure that there is extra assurance. We see that missing in a lot of the incidents.
Yeah, I'm not going to say 100%, but of all the incidents that we responded to in the last year or so that were related to like an email compromise, universally no multi-factor authentication on admin accounts. So not going to say it's going to mitigate it 100%, but it sure would make it a lot harder for a barrier to entry for the attackers to get in. And then, as we're going to show you too, and you can go to some of these other sessions on the actual attack techniques. Once you're in as admin, you're just an admin. I mean, you have the capability to do everything that you really care about from your own customer data in this case.
Absolutely. And so the multi-factor is a key piece. And the way that we think about it, and the way that the terminology that we use in the cybersecurity team, is it's not an absolute, it's not a guarantee, it's not 100%, but increases the attacker cost. How much would it cost me if I was an attacker trying to take your data, trying to do something with your enterprise assets? How much would it cost me without MFA if I just had a password to attack you? And how much, or if you just had a password, versus how much would it cost me if you were using MFA and I had to find a way to either spoof the MFA prompt or take over your phone? It's a lot more cost for me to take over your particular enterprise, your particular admin account. So the idea here is we're continually increasing the attacker cost because very advanced attackers can spend a lot of money. But if the only thing you have to worry about, because you've done all the stuff right, is a nation-state attacker, you've cut out a whole lot of pain. So you want to be constantly thinking in terms of how do I increase the cost of attack? How do I increase the cost to attack me against the things the adversaries like to do, against the cheap, easy, proven methods that they've got? So back to authentication security. Multi-factor is a great way to increase attacker cost. The other pieces that we found are very effective is integrating as much context and security intelligence as possible so that we understand, these are the bad IPs is pre-integrated in. Azure AD has done a phenomenal job of integrating a lot of those signals in there so that we're filtering out all the bad things that we know about on a very fresh basis. And additionally, in that middle bullet with the UEBA, we understand what's normal. And that's huge. Because if I have the right password and I get in, that's pretty cheap and easy. If I have the right password and I have to do the MFA thing, that's harder. If I have to actually show up from an IP or a place or a geography at about the same time that your user would, I have to learn that, I have to know it, and I have to imitate it to stay within that normal band so it doesn't look anomalous. And between the machine learning and the UEBA technology, user and entity behavior analytics, that are able to learn that quickly and profile those individual user behaviors, because what Matt does for a living and what I do for a living are completely different, and his travel schedule and where he's going to be, where I'm going to be, those are two different things. So you need to be able to know the individual user and then discover normal for them. And so we built a lot of that into Azure Active Directory because those are the kind of things that you do need to protect against these kind of attacks. And then the last piece is everything to do with the overall tenant configuration is critical because that tenant itself is fully exposed all the time. So if you miss a configuration or something like that from a security standpoint, we do have guidance on how to make sure you don't miss that. It has a bigger impact because that is exposed to the internet. But a little bit of hygiene, you're good to go there. So let's talk a moment about kind of how policy is changing a little bit to reinforce some of the points we discussed earlier. So in the days of on-prem, you worried about attackers going after your resources. your resources were kind of grouped together in one place on premise. So we put a firewall in there, and that took the attacks down significantly, and that worked for that generation. That worked so well that we kind of we piled just about every policy we could think of onto that same place because that was our single control point. Even if it didn't quite fit right, even if it wasn't the right place for an identity policy, a device policy, a database policy, that's where we put it because it's all we had. We said, okay, what's the IP of the database server? Well, that's not an application identification. It's just an IP address, right? And that can be spoofed or changed. There's a lot of risk to that. But we put it there because it was the only place we could put it. When we started evolving this was around the time when mobile devices came along. All of a sudden, we had to, because they weren't behind the firewall, create a new policy engine and policy that was tailored to those assets for mobile devices. That's where MDMs and now MAMs, mobile device management, mobile application management came along. So we actually had a specialized engine tailored towards exactly managing that type of asset and doing it well. If you've had MDM vendors, you may not agree that it's always done well. What really needs to happen now, and what is happening, and what Microsoft is investing in to help with this new world as the network becomes less relevant, still very important, but less relevant to security, is making sure that you have a policy engine for each of those types of assets to protect them. So protecting the information itself, protecting the databases, protecting the identities, protecting the endpoints, the mobile devices, protecting the SaaS apps in a way that makes sense for that, not just running them through a firewall or a network gateway and saying this is the way we've always done it, but actually looking at those assets and saying what kind of things do we need to do to protect what's important to the business. So Matt is actually going to show a demo to kind of give you an illustration of what this looks like with Cloud App Security, so you have a sense of what this looks like when you get that specialized control that works.
Yeah, so Mark and I we were going over stories before too, and then he was talking about that network one there too. I remember doing some work on an organization that had so many policies in there that they eventually couldn't troubleshoot them, so they put an any policy in there, which superseded every single policy they had in there. So, case in point there. So, a lot of those engines that Mark was talking about, they all require some sort of logging, because what we're doing here is we're correlating the data so that you no longer have to look at individual logs. And that's the benefit there, is to be able to take those heuristics and come up with a way that you can make some intelligence out of them. Nobody likes to look at individual logs because you have to figure out exactly what they mean. So this is Cloud App Security that we integrated into our demo tenant here. And thank you, Mark, for letting me do all the demos there. It's always fun to see how the demos work.
You're welcome.
We don't have this is a demo tenant, so there's not a ton of data. There's a lot of built-in anomaly detections, as Mark was mentioning, like geolocations for user behavior. In this case, I'll show you a few of those. I made a couple custom alerts in here based on, for example, I made one for administrative activity. So what this does here is if I have a smaller tenant, for example, and I've got one administrator, I'd like to know what that administrator does or if any other admins do. And so what this will do is it'll automatically alert me to certain behaviors that I've set up in the engine based on the policy I set up. For example, one of the policies you can say is if an administrator does this 5 times in a row over a short period of time, I want to get an alert on that, and I want that to be sent to me. So that's exactly what I've done in there. So think about like an attack where you've got some sort of script running where you're maybe trying to forward email, for example. That would be something that the administrator would flag on. So in this case right here, this administrator activity from operations 1 wasn't an administrator in our original tenant, and I just made that person an administrator to see what they were doing. In this case, it was deleting a user. What's nice too is there's some features that you can do in here too in case like you would want to react to this situation. So you can send this to another group if you've got a large organization and have a whole queuing system. But in this case here, if I get this alert that gets sent to me, and you can have it sent to you in a variety of ways, I can do things like require this person to sign out again, or better yet, suspend users. So I was working a recent case where a CEO's account was compromised, and while the CEO was reading their email, they were watching the attacker actually forward on their email. And this is the technique we used. We used a custom rule to set it up for their VIPs to see exactly what was going on, and then we were able to suspend their sessions and then gain back control of those accounts and then track it down that way. That's one way we were able to do that with Cloud App Security. And like I said, there's a lot of other capabilities in there. Example here would be the login locations that Mark was talking about. In this case, you can see I've been in Florida all week, so that's my login information. But imagine if I had the anomaly detection where I was doing this for weeks on end, and after it learned its user behavior, I started logging in from, I don't know, Chechnya or something like that. Then it would flag there, and then I would know that this was an anomalous activity, and I could have some policies to take action against it. We've talked a lot about email, too. It doesn't just extend to email. There's a lot of other aspects to it, too. Remember, this is for, in this case, Office 365 is Microsoft's preeminent application for this, so that's going to have a lot of features in there. So, for example, I could look at data sharing. And we don't, again, I don't have anything to show you that I'm sharing out externally, but you can see where your files are being shared. Are they shared internally, externally? And then you can make some policy rules in there. One of my favorite ones is if you have something shared externally or shared with other applications like Dropbox or Salesforce, you can have automatic revocation policies in there. So you can have something that says, if I've got something that's shared out for more than 30 days from an individual or group, that it automatically revokes that sharing and gets rid of it. So there's some really powerful tools you can do there. And like I said, a lot of it's based on logging, and we're going to show you how the logs get in there. But wanted to show you overall these new engines that we're talking about and how how valuable they are when you're really trying to make intelligence out of activity that's going on worldwide.
So how many people think you could do those rules in a firewall? Not seen any hands. This is the power of putting those engines where they belong and making sure you have the right tools in the toolbox for the security folks.
Yeah, so we want to talk a little bit about some of the changes and trends too, because again, you've moved a lot of your assets from an on-premise to something that's in the cloud. So there's your attack surface is significantly different. There's a whole session down there, so feel free to watch that presentation later on that's recorded, because they're going to go into demos of a lot of these. But just kind of a show of hands, has anybody heard of like a password spray attack? Is it something that everybody's been reading up on? Awesome. Okay, a few folks there. So just for the rest of you, it used to be that when you went against something like a VPN server, a user's individual machine, or an individual mailbox, that you would do some brute force attacks, which I do show up there is something that's still there. You would try many, many times against a single account with a big password list and try and get in. The attackers aren't really doing that anymore when you're talking about attacking cloud assets anymore. What they're doing is they're taking a small subset of passwords, maybe some common ones that they know, some traditional keyboard walks if they were looking at administrators, as complicated as they want to do. And what they're doing is they're taking that small subset and spraying it out against a lot of customers and organizations at once in hundreds and hundreds of thousands of accounts. What their goal is at that point is that they have enough folks to go after. Some of those are going to be working. Some of them are going to be valuable. And then they'll evaluate what access they've got based on those accounts to see if they need to prosecute the systems, the targets, and the individuals, and if they can parlay that into even better access through either password reuse against other assets, like I said, VPNs, for example, or if they would even be able to use that in a social setting. And again, a lot of these are more of an application and data layer attack as opposed to going against the operating system directly. There is still social engineering involved in here. One of the big social engineering advantages of the way they're doing this is, imagine if you've gotten access to legitimate users with the password sprays. You can do a lot of real social engineering with their actual account, send it to other IT staff, say you're having an issue. Depending on what protections they have in there for email protection, you might be able to get access that way because you're actually inside the network. So social engineering is still valued.
And another example of that is if I take over the CEO's account and then I send an email to the CFO, hey, we need to authorize this transaction to this vendor and this account number, they're doing social engineering at all steps. They're not actually doing technical exploits at all.
Exactly. Another one that's a little bit newer is the delegation and forwarding rules. So once you have access to a tenant like an Office 365, the attackers have figured out that you can delegate authority to read other people's emails, or you can forward this on automatically to other areas. It's not anything too new, but it's something that we're seeing a lot more because the attack surface is so much larger. And then delegation, as I'll show a little bit later on some of the logs, is interesting because it's, in a lot of cases, it would be called an owner action, which is not something that's typically logged by default. But delegation does give you the ability to look in other people's emails or send on behalf of them in the case of social engineering, like Mark was saying. And it makes it a little bit more difficult to look at because you're not looking at the logs of that particular owner, even though it's somebody else looking at them. PowerShell scripts as well. A lot of these assets can be managed through PowerShell. But think about PowerShell in this way. PowerShell is not the issue in this case. Think of it as just the new way to live off the land. So when you were attacking an on-premise system before an attacker was doing that, they would use a lot of the built-in tools, the net use tools, the DS queries if they were going to go against LDAP, for example, PSExec. But now they can just use some of the PowerShell scripts and try and do some enumeration against the Active Directory in the cloud and some of the users and accounts. And that's really what they're doing. They're using that for their reconnaissance, and then they're using that for their automatic setting up of forwarding rules, delegation rules. And again, that session does do a demonstration of exactly that. One thing is to note, too, a lot of the general reconnaissance tools where you would just want to get information on a particular user, for example, those aren't really logged by default at all as well. It's more of the actions where you're making changes to the mailboxes, you're making changes to the user's accounts. Those actions are logged, but the reconnaissance ones are not.
And it's kind of interesting on that delegation forwarding rules and also the owner, non-owner auditing, because Matt and I essentially started from what are the current attacks, which is how we start with any of our guidance. What's emerging, what's trending, what do we expect the next step is going to be, but mostly focused on what the current state of the art is in terms of the attacks. And then we write the guidance that makes sense architecturally for the platform. What is the most sustainable defenses that are the easiest to do? And I had this, almost embarrassing epiphany this morning, this realization that why am I learning about exchange logs in non-owner versus owner auditing that has been in Exchange since I don't even know when, for years, decades maybe. And it finally occurred to me that, you know what, much like the IT responsibilities are being compressed into those top 3 blue layers, so too are the defenders, because we're fighting the attackers where they're going. We're fighting on that turf of the app layer. We're fighting on the turf of the data layer, the identity layer. We're actually moving the battleground there, and so we have to get better at those app layer pieces to be able to deal with the attacks, because that's where they're moving. Because they're not, again, putting the malware on the Exchange server, the SharePoint server, which is, the typical way of doing things on-prem. They're actually doing the attacks at that app layer, and so you have to learn that territory to fight back on it. So it was an interesting dynamic for me that I was like, oh, it's just moving to the app layer. So anyway. So some other key changes, just to kind of wrap up this section on what's really different when you look at the world from this cloud view. PowerShell for administration, much like the attackers are going there, the administrators are going there. That's just part of the new world, and that's how a lot of administration is being done. The other thing, and this is really particularly aimed at the security analysts of the audience, the people that look at the logs, that set up the tools, the authentication model has changed. So the way that the authentication flows, the protocols, where you're going to find the logs, what kind of tools you need to analyze them, all of that has changed. Much more browser dominated, much more cloud protocols like all the different, I can't think of the protocol names. Wow, okay, embarrassing moment for Mark. But all the new modern protocols, these flow differently than a normal Kerberos or NTLM log on premise, so that's something that the security analysts really have to get comfortable with and familiar with and learn how those flow so that they can do the appropriate troubleshooting. Again, as much as we could automate into Azure Active Directory and the logging pieces has been done, but you just have to recognize that the protocols have also changed where logon happens. So this next one is actually really beneficial, and you saw it with the way the cloud app security works. We didn't have to go in and set up static rules in a SIM and figure out IPs and figure out usernames and author those and write those and adjust those like we've had to in the past. Because Office 365 is a very consistent SaaS app in terms of the logs that it produces, and it's got the API that you can plug your SIM into, or you can plug in a cloud app security into, you can have off-the-shelf logging, off-the-shelf analytic engine, click them together, and then the value starts coming immediately, because it is consistent. So that's one of the nice benefits as we move to this world. You don't have to hook it up to the Exchange server and check the OS logs and this and that. It's a lot easier because these things know how to talk to each other as mature, self-contained, off-the-shelf software as a service apps, SaaS apps. So now this is the big one. So we mentioned this earlier a little bit, but you don't have to upgrade Exchange or SharePoint or any of these things. It magically comes to you. And that comes with a couple of different implications. You know, it's always current. You always got the latest and greatest, which is awesome. But this also means that as security professionals, we have to understand this and we have to keep up with it. We can't just say, oh, we're on Exchange 2010 and forget about it, right? You have to actually stay up and stay fresh on what's coming, what's on the roadmap, because two things happen. One is you get free features that, oh my gosh, I need to use this because this makes life easier. But you also have stuff that, you know what, here's a new capability, you know, Sway or some other capability that's coming in. I need to understand the security implications of it. There's a new Skype feature. How do I make sure that I've configured that according to my organization's policy and our intent to keep us secure? So you have to keep up with it for a couple different reasons. And so that's just a big piece that you have to just set up a regular cadence and keep an eye on that. We've got a couple resources that are in the slides. Be able to download those, click on them, check them out. It's not that hard to find the Office 365 roadmap either, but you know, keep up on that. That's a very, very key thing.
Yeah, it's interesting too. We were talking to another presenter too, and notice he said PowerShell administration. And you'll notice that if you were doing any test lab guides too recently on Office 365, most of them are done in PowerShell. It used to be nice graphical pictures on that. There's a reason for that. The other presenter we were talking about was getting ready to do their demo, and we had put some new features out at Ignite that basically killed the interface that he was using for his demo. So anyway, something you have to keep up on for sure, and definitely learn the PowerShell aspects, because those are still the underlying, you know, how to get something done and how to set anything in there. So,
yep.
So we're going to talk a little bit about logs now too. So this is just a very general log primer here. You can spend a ton of time in that, but a little bit about some of the key log locations when we're talking about an Office 365 environment as a whole and putting in some of the protections. So Azure Active Directory, there's some logging in there specific to the account authentication and management. Now some of that ends up in Office 365 as well, but there is a little bit of that you have to look at it individually in for example, looking at adding somebody as a global administrator, for example, that would be something in Azure Active Directory. Office 365 Security Compliance Center, this is where the bulk of your logs are going to be for your owner activity. That would be everything that I as a user is doing to my account. If I'm deleting a file, if I'm moving it over to a folder, if I'm forwarding it on, that's the owner information in there. And you actually do have to set that up separately, which I'll show. And then the non-owner information, what the administrator can do and any non-owner is doing to my account. Those are on by default, and those are on by default because, you know, for the most part, those would be the anomalous activity that you would want to check up on. And then Mark's got a slide later, too, about some of the SIEM integration and how you could do that to offload that if you've got a traditional SIEM on there. One thing to note, and this was pretty evident to us when we were building the demos there, there's delay in the logs, right? Microsoft has, I don't know, what did you say, it was like 400 billion or something like that, events or something? 450
billion authentications a month happen in our authentication services.
Yeah, so there's a little bit of a delay when it gets into your tenant there. The timestamps are correct. We did check some of that, but the logs will get delayed about 30 to 60 minutes. All of those logs are really key, and again, we'll show a little bit of demo on that, but what's interesting about that is that's all that's needed to do a lot of the user behavior analytics. So you can look at them individually, but you have to make sure that a lot of those are on so that the intelligence systems can basically learn. All right, so let's move on to some other stuff here, a little bit of demo.
Yep, you're good.
Okay. So the first thing I want to talk about is this concept of secure score. And this is something you can get from the security and compliance section in your Office 365 tenant. Are a lot of people familiar with secure score? Have they looked at it a little bit? Okay, awesome. I think it's amazing because it can walk you through.
How many folks have not used secure score? Okay, it's about half and half in the room. Cool, thank you.
Awesome. So Secure Score is this concept that Microsoft put together for Office 365 that says there's a lot of key features that you need to protect your investment and protect the tenant. So they put that in there as some recommendations. And then they give you kind of a target score to try and go toward based on your organization. And then you can slowly implement those and evaluate those as you want. So you can see in the demo tenant here, I've got an 84 score, and it gives me some recommended actions there. What I really like about this is it keeps everything in one place, so you can look at the security protections that you want to put in there, and then it gives you a good explanation on them. So let me look at like this one here that we were talking about recently, that if I want to do auditing of what owner activity is related to all the mailboxes. So what me as the owner of my mailbox is doing, if I want to get that logging, I would have to turn that on. And this has gives me a little bit of information about why I'm doing this, what my users will be affected, and then it tells you to either launch it. In this case, this capability is turned on with a PowerShell script, but there's other ones that you can automatically turn on. So one that you might that we didn't recommend initially is because it's really dependent on your organization. But high on the list here would be to enable something like client forwarding rules to block. So this basically sets up a transport rule in Exchange so that if you were sending this off to, say, Outlook, for example, and you forwarded it on to Gmail, that this would prevent that automatic forwarding on there. So you maybe wouldn't want your users to do that. But not every organization is the same, so these are some of the rules that you would have to evaluate separately. But all of this is in here based on what Microsoft has prioritized as we think valuable ones. And as you can see, as we talked before, enable MFA for all global admins is number one there, and it's still not enabled in a lot of ways. And like I said, this is just right off of the Security and Compliance Center, and it really does help walk you through what you can do and what you can have to increase your security in your tenant. So highly recommend you look at that if you haven't seen that. You can see right here, even my demo tenant, which has not very much on, is a lot better than the average Office 365 score right now. So we're really pushing this heavily to make it really easy for the customers to add some critical controls that we know based on our experience and based on our own user behavior analytics that we see that are really improve the security.
And for the folks that are always looking to find a way to say, hey, we need to get better at it, you can sort of use that average score maybe as a way to show, hey, industry trending, we want to get ahead of that. So sometimes benchmarks convince leaders to move things forward. So it's another possible way that you could use it.
So I wanted to show something else. So this is the security and compliance section here, and I wanted to show a little bit about e-discovery. Not very much. That can be its own whole topic on e-discovery, but I wanted to point out one interesting thing about e-discovery. In this one here, I set up a user who was responsible for could do searching on other people's emails based on some search criteria. And you can see I was looking for malware, spam, and evil. So this user goes out there based on some sort of e-discovery case and can look for this information. Now what's interesting to note on this is we talked a little bit about the delegation attacks, but what we didn't talk about it is in the context of e-discovery. So we can see as this user has searched for these, and in this case I'm doing it for good purposes here, and then you can download the original email. So you have to consider that your e-discovery roles also are really critical roles, as well as they're almost like delegation roles that you need to start monitoring as well. We have seen some attacker trends where they're using these e-discovery ones where they'll look for critical information on like key projects that you would have in your organization. And it's not something that a lot of people think about in looking for your traditional delegation roles, but these e-discovery roles do have full access to be able to read emails if they're given those particular privileges.
And you'll see in the roadmap where we recommend when you apply a rule to the admins, because you want to protect those powerful admin accounts, you also want to include the e-discovery rules in that because of the business impact that they could have with this visibility across all the data, the potential visibility. It is logged, it is tracked, but it is a very powerful way for attackers to gather intelligence and achieve their objectives. So we consider this equally impactful to an admin as far as the need to protect it.
Exactly. So then if you go into the compliance section as well, you'll see that there's an audit log search. So this would be like your traditional logs, and you can export these to other SIEMs and all of that. But I wanted to show you that there's a lot of a lot of baked-in features in there for doing it, except, like I said, the owner rules. So you can go in here and you can see a lot of the different filters that are in there. One of the ones I wanted to bring up here was I enabled owner logging, and then I gave some delegation rights to somebody who shouldn't have access to another person's email. So for example, one of the delegation rights that an attacker might use would be you want to send on behalf so that you can impersonate them and have some really good social engineering. You're sending it as an IT person. It looks exactly like that user. You don't get the little message that says send on behalf. So in this case, you can see that that kind of information is logged in here in a little bit different way on how we characterize the message, but you can see, for example, it'll say this particular person was delegated to regular user, and they're sending as this particular regular user, even though their user ID is IT admin 1. Now, I wouldn't want to look at these logs like this manually. This is exactly why we pass this stuff off onto something like MCAS, so that we can have automated alerts for the information that we think is critical, and based on a lot of the common attacks. And there is the anomaly detection that's built in, but it's always nice to have some custom ones based on your use cases as well. But this is how the logs are tracked in there. A lot of the different operations are logged in there too, and you can spend some time with it, demo it. You'll see, understand how kind of the sausage is made, and then you'll see why we created the user behavior analytics in there. All right. Cool.
All right, so that's the first half of the presentation, with kind of what does the world look like from a cloud view? What is life like on the cloud? So the next logical question is, how do I get there? How do I avoid the mistakes of those who have gone before me? Anyone? Yeah, okay. So the common errors that we typically see, and Matt, feel free to jump in because I know you have plenty of fun stories from the front lines. Privilege hygiene is kind of the category where things around the admins, like most pronounced is the MFA, but there's a lot of other things that really should be done as well. And that's where we baked into that to the 30-day plan to make sure that you have the dedicated admin account. You're actually coming and doing the admin work on a machine that's at least got good hardware integrity validations from Windows 10. Like, it's actually a good solid machine, not, the XP machine off to the side that we haven't patched in a while that you're using for your Office 365 admin. So we see a lot of those kinds of things. And again, when we say admins, every time we say it, we include those e-discovery accounts, anything that's a very powerful delegated role. Frequently, we see that for HR or for compliance accounts as well.
Yeah, let me give you an example. We did a case about 6 months ago where every organization's got their HR folks, right? You have employees that leave for a variety of reasons. HR might want to do an investigation, which is a lot of the purpose of an e-discovery. But if you're using an account that all of HR uses, for example, and that account gets compromised, that they have a lot of, in this case, they use that to do a lot of triage against other users' accounts. And it was something that actually took us a while to figure out because it wasn't something that was traditionally highlighted as an admin type account. So we definitely add that to our playbook of tracking down how attackers are using it.
Yep. And the shared accounts, they're bad in the old world, they're bad in the new world. And this is, I like to go back to the theory, as you guys can probably imagine. If I have my name on an account and I'm accountable for it and I get fired for it, if it's abused, I'm going to think about that account and that password differently than, oh, that's a shared account that I know Matt and at least 2 other people know. People treat those differently, and they actually behave differently on that. So having a named account, having that individual accountability is, we found to be very critical for success in this, because you really have to recognize those human behavior aspects of it so that people are going to do the right thing. Broad permissions, same as it was on-prem, you permission stuff out too much, and it creates a major risk. We also, for both the admin as well as for the data, CAS is, the Cloud App Security is really good at identifying the data risks, and you can also set up your own alerts, and you also get a lot of alerts on the admins as well.
And I can't say enough about the revocation capability, where if you've got automatic sharing out there external to your organization, you just set a policy and it just revokes all of the sharing rules. To me, that's
if you see a confidential document that's open to the internet, you want that engine to automatically pull that back and then probably send emails to the IT admin, the security guy, the manager, and all of those things can be set up in a Cloud App Security rule. So very, very powerful way of managing that level of security.
And we're not only just talking about Office 365 and sharing. The nice thing, too, is when you've discovered the other applications that you're using on your network, let's say you're using Dropbox for something like that, you can tell, you can set up a policy that'll say, I don't want OneDrive to share with Dropbox anymore. You can do those type of policies, or you can revoke those too. So sharing between applications is something on the back end that you traditionally couldn't do, but it's accessible now when you discover what's available on your network. So.
And for the geeks among us that's wondering, okay, how does it do it? Current capability, APIs, so it actually manages those. You own those tenants. You set the CAS up so that it manages and is the admin of those tenants. They're going to do it that way. And then we also just recently introduced and announced the proxy capability to broaden the ability to do that with many more applications. And so that piece is just recently added. So from a tenant perspective, not having that logging enabled, not only does it keep you from seeing that user analytics stuff if you have cloud app security, but it also gets in the way of doing incident investigation, especially when you talk about those social engineering attacks where they take over the CEO's email, send an email to the CFO, say transfer this. By default, that logging is actually off for anything I do to my own mailbox. But now, if I had done that to somebody else's mailbox, I had messed with their delegation forwarding rules, and I was doing that as a different account, that would be tracked by default, no problem. But the actual logs for me doing things within my own mailbox is not on by default. So we found that it's very difficult to track those social attacks that way. Another one that was interesting, we haven't seen a lot of incidents recently on this, but we did see this, especially in the early days. If someone had a fairly weak password policy on premise and they use federation, it's only like a couple characters, maybe no complexity required. Those passwords, when you federate that, are now exposed, those weak passwords, to the internet. So if someone has those, they're much more susceptible to a brute force or a password spray attack. If you create an account in Azure Directory natively, it's pretty strong setup by default. You're in good shape, and you actually have to go into PowerShell to turn it off or to weaken that. So Azure AD accounts are pretty good, but when you bring that on-premise that's always been behind the firewall and you've accepted the risk of weak passwords in the past, and you all of a sudden expose that to the internet, we have seen some security issues and incidents from that. And then the other thing is this is just kind of sad in some ways.
How many people manage an Office 365 environment right now? How many people know all the security features that you actually have, and how many do you use them? How many people are using ATP, for example? Okay, so a small number of folks. Others, I assume, are using something else like Palo Alto or something, correct?
And for the recording, there was a lot of hands up on the first question, and then using the features was actually pretty low. So Thank you for coming. We hope that this gets you to turn them on.
You wouldn't believe how many places we go to that when we ask them about reviewing email attachments automatically, scanning them or detonating ones there, they don't actually realize they've already bought the feature, and it's just not turned on. So when we get there, we'll turn it on for them, and a lot of things will light up there. So definitely check that. That's in the on the threat side of there. You can see it's pretty easy to set up. Basic malware detection is straightforward, and then you might want to again look and see what your user pain level would be. As if you have an attachment that nobody sees, do you want to detonate it? Do you want to block it? Do you want to just send it on without the attachment, just the information? So those are some of the things you have to test and see how your users react to that.
Yep. And even in our technology centers, when customers come in, sometimes they say, "Wait a moment, I got to log in my tenant, turn that on," after they learn about the fact that the feature exists and they own it. Some other just general things here at the end. There's a big difference between the value and risk to your business of today's special on the cafeteria menu versus the value and risk of your strategy for the next fiscal year that your competitor could thwart if they know about it. And you have to recognize that just because it's a doc doesn't mean that intrinsically tells you its value. You have to understand what business critical data is out there so that you can protect that at a higher level. And that's something that's on the IT and the security departments to work with your business units to understand what is it that makes the difference to the business. What is the stuff that will really, really hurt us, that will put us in the press, that will put us at a competitive disadvantage so that we can make sure that the protections for that are where they need to be versus trying to protect everything. That's a critical thing that we've seen a lot, and even in the incidents, if I recall correctly.
Sure.
Yeah. So secure score, we saw about half the folks in the room, so great, and I'm hoping the other half is now going to raise their hand the next time we have a session and get you guys in there and get that going. So another thing that we're seeing, which is, so this is, we have one specific example around it, but it's also a general thing. We see a lot of security departments that really have kind of an arm's length to the cloud. They don't really necessarily trust it, and they're trying to avoid using it if all possible. So they redirect, they pick federation over password sync is the main example here. And the reason that we're highlighting that is when you look at what's happening right now, I'll give you guys a statistic. Two statistics, actually. In the dark markets where bad guys exchange stuff and buy access to networks, buy corporate credentials, et cetera, there's a couple dozen markets right now that are buying and selling corporate credentials. There are approximately, in our research, about 12 million corporate credentials that are for sale at this moment in time. So corporate credentials, and they're used for ransomware. They buy them and get in through the remote access. They're used for a lot of different reasons. But that is a very difficult thing to combat when you're in a purely on-prem state and you federate things in. There's no really good mechanism to protect you against that. But if you sync the passwords and the password, specifically the password hashes, not the passwords, to Azure Active Directory through one of the password sync mechanisms, you can take advantage of the leak credential protection in Azure AD where we monitor those sources, and then we can actually tell you if you've got a hit, and then you can enforce policy on your users, make them reset their password if they've got a compromised credential in the wild that a criminal could buy.
Yeah, this is probably my new favorite feature actually that I've was messing around with. So think about this, right? We've all seen in the news on Pastebin, right? Pastebin's got a bunch of credentials leaked, or GitHub, or somebody's downloaded a bunch of torrents, and it's got all those in there. So this feature, what this will do is it makes a hash of your hash, essentially, and it'll start checking for those sites and look to see if anything matches that. And if it does, then there's a risk profile that you can add to your users in our conditional access policies. There would be a high-risk user. A high-risk user means that we found a hash somewhere on, as Mark said, the dark web or some of the other places that we look there. So in that case, you automatically have a policy. You can make all of your users a high risk, for example, that basically says if Microsoft has seen that anywhere when they're doing their collection on that, automatically force that user to reset their password because it's no longer valid because somebody owns it. It's a pretty cool feature. I think it's one that a lot of people probably don't know about, and definitely worth checking into because of that nice automated. But you can't do it unless you sync your local passwords.
If you're fully federated and you're only doing authentication on-prem, you're hugging your servers, you love them, you know, they're warm and they're friendly. That's great, but it's not going to get you those kind of scaled out protections against the current types of attacks that are going on. And the cloud really has become a source of security in so many ways that, you know, it's not just more secure to be running on the cloud in many cases for many workloads, but it's also a source of security for some of the on-prem assets as well. So now we're to the roadmap. So this is what we would recommend. When you break all this down, when you look at Secure Score, you look at all these different things, what should I do first, right? What should I be doing the moment I step out of here or I'm logging into my tenant as I'm sitting here in the audience? Not that that would happen. What should I be doing? And we broke this down by the first month, the first quarter, and then kind of after that. So we picked the things that you could implement quickly that would have the most impact. So we're looking for impact against the attacks we see all the time, and quick, low impact, not going to get in the way of your users type of things. So first of all, separate admin account if you don't have it. Make sure you have a dedicated, unique admin account that is not the same as the one you use to check your email and look at docs on SharePoint. And then for that admin account, and this is for both the e-discovery as well as the normal admin roles that you're familiar with, you want to enforce multi-factor authentication, absolutely no question. And you also want to be accessing it, and we've got some conditional access rules on it. We want to enforce that they're actually coming from a compliant computer. We strongly recommend Windows 10 that has the hardware assurances for secure boot and code integrity on it so that you know that it's difficult for an attacker to compromise it because there's no unpatched vulnerabilities, et cetera. The more that we have those level of assurances, the more comfortable we are because the attackers go after the host, they go after the places where the admins log on, and then they steal the credentials from that and or do impersonation from there. So that is, first thing in the 30-day plan is threat protection for those admins. Second is to make sure you turn on Cloud App Security and connect it to your O365 tenant. And I don't think we covered that in depth.
Yeah, we did.
And the interesting thing about this dynamic as we wrote it is that information protection and identity access management, they're not interchangeable, but they have a very close relationship to each other because when you look at what is my baseline protection of information, it's really to set up an identity perimeter, to set up a set of controls for authorization and authentication that meet a minimum bar. And so you'll see some of these things that could fit in other categories, but we found that the back and forth in information protection and identity access management were really, really strong. And
there's the feature that we were talking about before where it'll for the risk profiles, that's the Azure AD identity protection we were talking about. So that's a link to that. And Mark had talked about the differences with your federated account policies versus the ones in the cloud. So you got to remember which one supersedes the other. The other ones are default in Office 365. There's some pretty tight policies in there. You can change them. That would be a PowerShell thing. There's no way to really change that directly from the GUI. So.
Yep. And so in that federated scenario or any scenario where you can set the password on-prem, you want to make sure you are at a strong policy and that your users have changed it since that policy was set so that you're not dealing with these legacy 4-character, 8-character weak passwords. Because the bad guys, they've got really good password spray and generation techniques. They've got amazing databases of the most common passwords that most users pick. As humans, we're remarkably similar to each other. Let's just leave it at that, because the top passwords are really, really poor in those password dumps. And the last piece is in the security management space. Again, calling out to that document we mentioned on the reference designed for the political campaigns. It's got your conditional access rules laid out. It's got all the things that you need to do to kind of checklist through the tenant. Lots and lots of really good information there on how to pull all these things together into a coherent design. And they have a great page on tenant setup and configuration that makes sure you touch on all of those things we discussed about the threat protection pieces, about the threat intelligence, the making sure you're looking at the secure score, turning all those SharePoint and Exchange tenant-wide settings and getting the right security set on those. So strongly recommend going through each of those pieces. So it's a fairly quick.
We've got some extra guides right here. Is that
yes. I don't know if that's that. There's a couple of different sets of printouts here. You're welcome to come up to the room. I don't know if it's the actual poster. We had a few left over from the previous section, so it's a special bonus today. Grab bag. And then you're going to see this reinforced. We want to regularly review the alerts, and there's a couple places to look at results and kind of where those alerts are. And we listed them out there specific to O365. You got your cloud app security, your threat dashboard within Office 365. I think it's the Security and Compliance Center section, and then the secure score itself. That should be a regular cadence, something that you're looking at either on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. And then we're going to show some of these conditional access rules we just described.
Yeah, so real quick, like what Mark was saying there, we're talking about some quick wins here in the 30-day. We're not saying put conditional access rules on all your users. That's something a little bit too tough there. Since a lot of you have done Office 365 management and your tenant there, you'll know that there's multi-factor authentication built into that. It's pretty easy to set up. And then what's really nice about it is you don't have, the user basically sets it up at the next logon. But there's not a lot of additional policies that are built into the Office 365 portion of that. Those are all in Azure Active Directory when you turn on the conditional access policies as part of EMS, correct? So this is in Azure Active Directory portal here, and this would be the conditional access policies under Azure Active Directory. I made a couple of default policies there. So for example, I made a policy here that basically says if I'm coming from a Windows 10 device, require that I use multi-factor authentication. But you can do it from anything. You could say allow those in there and then allow Windows 10 devices in there, but if I come from an iPhone, for example, require multi-factor authentication. In the case of what we're talking about for something like an administrative workstation, which is just basically what we're talking about there, I'd want to create like a new policy, and then I'd want to apply it to, for example, an administrator. If I can spell. I will verify that you can lock yourself out if you apply the policy without making sure that the system is set up. But it does warn you, but I didn't listen.
For those that haven't done demos before a large audience, there is a lot of risk.
And then what you can do here is now you've said that I've applied this to the specific user, and now I want to have, what is my enforcement rule in this case? So what we're talking about is this one here. This would be a compliant device. So this would be a lot more of a deeper rule. In this case, this compliant device requires Intune, and I'm not gonna pull up the Intune one. But what it'll be is there'll be additional policies on Intune for some of the hardware features that Mark was saying. For example, is the machine BitLockered, right? If you've got a traveling admin or something like that, you don't want to lose your laptop. We want to make sure that that is blocked. Is code integrity turned on? Is secure boot turned on? Are they on the most current operating system? Those are some of the access controls that you can put on there and push that against that particular user. So in this case, I would say I want to make sure that my device is compliant, so it would check the compliance there. And then I always like to add extra multi-factor authentication as well. So both of those would be required to grant access. And then you can enable that particular policy. So it's a lot more fine-grained for being able to basically build a very quick and dirty admin workstation that you know is going to have a lot of good health compliance checks in order to gain access. And then there's some remediation capabilities built into Intune to make that device compliant. And that's the basics of conditional access. There's a few nuances in there, so I definitely check them when you can make exceptions. You can do them as granular as per individual application, for example. And like we said, there can even be rules that if you're a high-risk profile user, for example, that you can that you might be required to reset your password if something happens. So definitely, but the basics of what we were talking about here is basically an Intune managed device, Windows 10, that's most current, that has the basic security features turned on and requires multi-factor authentication. That's what we're recommending for administering your Office 365 tenant.
Yep. And one of the things that we did learn as we went through the conditional access rules was that it's fairly simple from a pure logical perspective to set the conditions about when this rule will fire, but there is sometimes the ability to do quite a bit of logic on the enforcement side. So some of those may actually go back and say, well, do this if that. So just keep in mind that there is a good amount of logic embedded on the actual execution side once the rule does fire. So as we move into the 90-day phase, we want to take what we've built there for the sort of make sure the basics are there, and then extend that, and not only just have, okay, they're coming from a good, solid, workstation that has the right security features on, but we'd like to actually get to a point where we have a dedicated workstation that is purpose-built for doing administration because of the risk of losing a tenant, because of a tenant admin, because of the risk of losing of an e-discovery and all the data that could go out. Those are very, very impactful events. We want to make sure that we have that higher level protection. And so there's some documentation on how to build a privileged access workstation or a PAW that is very strongly protected. It doesn't browse the internet except for going to Office 365 or Azure, whatever you administer, or on-premises AD as well. So that is essentially a services solution, or a professional consulting services solution that we open sourced so that you guys could take advantage of all the learnings and the hardening that we did. It's even got some scripts and automations to help you with that and to get that scenario going for you. So we strongly recommend that as you move into that past the 30 days, less than 90 days phase. And then the other piece is Azure AD PIM. And so Azure AD PIM can force you to multi-factor to proof up to get your admin rights, which doesn't sound all that particularly interesting because we're doing that on the account and the conditional access already. But the interesting thing about PIM, the Privileged Identity Management feature, is that it can do notifications for the admin, so it's a nice alerting and detection capability, so you know when people are using admin rights, and it fires that off and makes sure there's better visibility into that. And you can also do approval workflows, so that if you don't want anyone to become an e-discovery without the legal team, one of the people in the legal team approving, well, then you can do that and say no one can get this role even if they're eligible for it. Same thing with the global admins and those pieces as well. So very, very useful. It's not something you have to do right away, but it's something that you want to think through, plan through, and then put into place in that first quarter time frame. So if you have an on-premises SIM, which how many folks here, enterprise, have an on-premises SIM? Okay, seeing a good amount in the audience, about a quarter. And there is some reference information we're going to cover in a little bit, but this is the time, if you want to do it earlier, happy to do it. But this is the time where we'd expect by default you'd want to be plugging all those logs in, making sure you've got all the API calls set up right, et cetera, so that that SIM can then consume all those logs. Mm-hmm. Now, MCAS will get you stuff right out of the box. You don't have to write any rules. You don't have to do any of that detailed work. Cloud App Security is MCAS, by the way, in case we go a little too acronym happy on you. And then setting up the SIM takes a little bit more time to make sure it knows how to do that, depending on the SIM.
But definitely in a hybrid scenario, it makes a lot of sense to, especially from the federated logs as well, so you can do the correlation a lot better internally when you're doing your own investigation work. So.
Absolutely. So in the information protection space, again, we're going to refer you back to that. It's at the AKMS Secure Campaign document we talked about earlier. There's a great set of reference rules for general conditional access for the whole tenant, as well as Azure information protection rules for those really, really sensitive pieces of documents that we mentioned earlier, those key strategic, high impact, kind of the proverbial $1 billion document, making sure that you have all the right encryption, the phone home capability, the tracking, the revocation in Azure information protection. So great reference information there, and adapt that to your scenario as appropriate. The political campaign thing tends to be an extreme example, but the reality is the technical designs are very, very generally applicable. So identity access management, enforce MFA for all users, and this is something that helps strengthen it across the board. Security management, so again, secure score, you want to plan your next actions, block forwarding, so these are the things that are specific to you. So in that first quarter, you want to take a look at secure score. We've picked the stuff in this roadmap that is universally applicable to just about every organization sitting in this audience. Individually, you're going to decide whether or not you block forwarding. There's a lot of things in there that are really per your organization. And does this make sense for us, or do we need to actually do auto forwarding as a course of business? For example, there's many others, and so really use that secure score to plan your next steps. The threat intelligence, there's a new feature that was just recently announced about conducting attack simulation. It's a new feature in Office 365. It allows you to do password spray, to do password brute forcing of passwords. It allows you to do phishing and kind of track the results of that. And so that's a built-in feature of Office 365 that I think is very, very compelling in that first quarter space, so that you can actually start getting an understanding of where your users are. Who is the person that always clicks on everything? Everyone has someone like that in the organization. Can I get a yeah? Okay, there we go. And then, of course, the sharing risks. And this is a good time that now that cloud app security has been turned on. You've got a sense of what's going on the tenant. You've dealt with some of the urgent burning alerts that have come through. Now it's time to start looking at those kind of sharing risks that we were mentioning earlier, that a confidential doc is now shared for anyone on the internet.
Yep, I'm a big fan of the conducting the attack simulations, and I'm a bigger fan of it now that we've got a feature built into it, because you're not setting up a pen testing infrastructure that's left behind for somebody to use. So we get a lot of requests for that type of capability anyway. When we go on site to talk to customers. So it's nice that we've added that capability, so you can really do some testing on there. One last thing on the, Mark and I went back and forth on this too, about enabling multi-factor for most users. I mean, it's to the point now we all have phones, right? We all have phones. This should be something that's not really difficult for most places. There are some third world places that don't necessarily have them, but you don't need to have a smartphone. You can just have a regular phone. We could only think of really one example, maybe two, but one real example where we couldn't turn it on. We were working with a mining company, and everybody was underground, and they didn't get cell phone reception. So in that case, we used like a domain join machines only or something like that.
Yep. And just as a reminder, always be keeping an eye on those consoles, the Cloud App Security Threat Dashboard, Secure Score. Always be looking to those. Those are a great source of information. So as we look to beyond, the things that are very important, very impactful, but you may not be able to accomplish them in the quarter. In many cases, organizations are running a hybrid identity. They have an on-premises Active Directory. You need to protect that at the highest standards as well. There's a lot of attacks on that. And so we have a securing privilege access roadmap that is designed around protecting that scenario. It's actually very closely related to the PAW solution, the Privilege Access Workstation I mentioned earlier. So we recommend doing that so that you have that full coverage of the on-prem piece and the whole hybrid approach. Cloud App Security has some powerful features around insider threat, because it can monitor behavior and anomalies. So it's a great tool for those. Shadow IT is another application for Cloud App Security, so you can go and discover those other apps and start applying those same sets of rules to it. So if you're on Office 365, we want to get you secure on that, but you also have that Shadow IT problem that most organizations have to kind of discover and secure it. Again, an identity access management kind of leads into information protection. There is a lot more than just those default policies that Azure Information Protection can do, and so there's a lot of opportunity for those advanced and sophisticated policies to get more Azure Information Protection. Effectively, the short description of that is these documents phone home to get the key. They do, and you have to authenticate to get these documents, to get the key to open them up, so they're protected whether on a USB key or wherever they are. So very much great steps in the beyond phase. Secure Score, continue with that. Make sure your e-discovery is integrated in your legal process. That may happen earlier in reality, but you want to make sure that you have that on the to-do list. And that's pretty much the roadmap. And so I'm going to cover some of the reference materials so you know what's aware of, and then we'll take some questions from the audience. So the references that we've got here, just to make sure that you have them, this is a visual depiction. There's also the links for each of these integration points for integrating all the Microsoft products in your SIM. And so you can see how all those pieces fit in there. It is not a beautiful, perfect, simple story. We recognize that. We are talking about it. We're figuring out how do we help our customers simplify this. But the reality is you can get just about all of this cloud data into your SIM as well.
And it was a question we get all the time, so we put together a nice list of where actually where you can get the application interfaces so that you can connect them back to whatever SIEM solution that you're using.
Exactly. So this is a nice convenient thing. It's there on the internet, but we wanted to bring it together in one place for you. And then, some people ask, why do we reference all these different licenses and E5 and this and that? So this is also in that same document I mentioned earlier about the political campaigns and kind of the features and where they live. So just wanted to have a little bit of reference information for you there. And of course, we'd love you to evaluate the session. Tell us what you think. Hopefully you love it. And step on up to the mics, and we'd love to take questions. Try again?
Okay. Go ahead.
Go for it. We can hear you. We'll repeat if we need to.
You're close enough.
Yep.
Okay. There's been an awful lot of talk about Flow, Microsoft Flow, at the conference, and I was wondering if you've seen any. In watching your session, a lot of things were going along in my mind regarding Flow, and I was wondering if you have any concerns about new security threats surrounding Flow. For example, auto forwarding. There was a slide up there, and I could create a flow that would bypass that. I could create a flow from another tenant that reaches into this tenant and does things that might be otherwise prevented in the flow configuration. But
yes.
I would be real interested to hear your comments.
Yeah,
Flow.
definitely. I have a lot of concerns with that because we respond to it a lot. Yes, attackers are going to start using that tool. It's too good for doing that type of, automated prosecution, if you will. So, for sure.
Are there, with the tool set that you have, are you planning additional capabilities regarding monitoring flow, controlling flow, et cetera?
Yeah, so again, that's one of the reasons we recommended MCAS too, because a lot of those are going to be anomalous type of activities that you can put some policies against to try to track. I'm sure that as we start seeing the evolution of that, we'll put in more stringent ways to
all right, thank you.
Yeah, there's a great quote on threat detection that, sooner or later the adversary has to do something that a normal user wouldn't do, and it's your job to spot that. And that's where tools like MCAS can help with that on all these different new kind of execution platforms or engines or whatever. You just have to be able to spot the anomalies and identify the risks. So yeah, it is something that we're looking into. Thank you. Sir.
Hi. We have been extensively using almost all the components and deploying for customers as well. I have a couple of questions. For cloud app security, I believe you mentioned that there's new proxy capabilities available to extend protection to other SaaS apps that are not on the list. Is
Yes.
that
They were
already?
announced and discussed at the conference. I didn't catch the sessions, so I don't have a lot of details on that, but I do know that it has extended the capability significantly.
Yeah, it just announced earlier in the week. So.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And Attack Simulator as part of threat intelligence, is that geared towards Office 365 centric workloads? For example, like brute force
Again,
attacks?
just announced, but my understanding is it is focused on Office 365. I do not know if you can fish outside of it or if it restricts.
Yeah, because it's supposed to be in the threat intelligence portal on Office 365. We didn't get a preview copy, unfortunately, because I wanted to show that.
Gotcha. Okay. All right. Thank you. Appreciate
Thank you.
it.
Yes.
this. So what are the recommendations for synchronizing passwords for service accounts that are used for on-prem so you can leverage those security tools? To me, it doesn't really make sense to synchronize a service account up to Azure AD if it's not going to be used there.
No, it wouldn't be an email account, so.
So you're saying it doesn't make sense to you to synchronize up to Azure AD? I didn't quite catch that.
Service accounts. So if
service accounts.
Yeah.
Why, you wouldn't necessarily want to synchronize a service account to Azure Active Directory.
Because you
That's a
wouldn't
good
know
question.
if that account is compromised because those accounts are
Yeah,
traditionally
it would
higher
be,
risk because they're...
it would be a trade-off because, do you want to have it up there for the detection capability in case it's up there and being traded on the dark markets and bought and sold? So you would get the benefit of it, but you wouldn't necessarily need it to be used in Azure AD. You just want the only reason you would put it up there would be for the detection.
Yeah, okay. But we do have to synchronize the password to be able to leverage that. Is that correct?
Because you'd have to synchronize.
I'm not
all of
familiar
the
with the granularity of which accounts you can pick. I believe you could filter them out depending on how you're structured on your internal AD, but I'd have to double check that. I don't know how you can scope the password synchronization off the top of my head, and I don't want to give you anything incorrect.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay.
My question was, we use MFA on all the global admins, but some Office 365 services, in particular Skype, don't allow PowerShell management if you have MFA. So
Right.
that's a big gap for us. Like we have to maintain other global admin accounts for the people that manage Skype. Is that on the roadmap to fix?
I have not seen any promised stuff on the roadmap, but the need for PowerShell and MFA I know is something that they're looking into. It's something that we can.
It's definitely talked on regularly, so like you said, we haven't seen any official roadmap, but it's definitely something that
Yeah,
well
it's definitely a topic of interest. I can tell you that much. I don't know how much deeper it's gotten in terms of committing to it, if that makes sense.
Okay, and then sort of related to that is sort of it ties into the service account question. Like we use some, like we're doing more automation, so scripting. Those are the other accounts that aren't MFA'd is our service accounts. And again, I worry we have little visibility if they were used in other ways. Is there best practice guidance on how to do that?
So you're talking about like if you were scripting an account, a function, you wouldn't obviously.
Correct. Like we use a global admin level essentially at this point to script a bunch of group provisioning or auditing, memberships to generate reports into CSV files, things like that.
Yeah, so I wouldn't look at like necessarily MFA, but I would look at the other conditional access policies too. So you could do like trusted locations, for example. So you could see where those scripts are always run from and then do like a trusted location policy.
Okay.
Yeah, and some of the documentation team is in the room, so we're definitely hearing that feedback, and we can look into writing up some best practices around that.
Okay, and I'd like to talk to you after about the client forwarding rules block.
Okay.
Okay. Sir.
Yeah, sorry. Actually, to build on the kind of what he was talking about is around, there's some accounts that are there as global admins, like the AAD Connect account, the account for Windows Intune. So what specific kind of recommendations do you do around those accounts which have to be there, have to have that level of access? Like what's your, how do you secure those?
Yeah, so again, depending on what you're using those ones for, I personally like the trusted location ones because I can figure out the where it's coming from in the organization. That's one, and then we did a lot of policies based on the type of hardware they were coming from too. So we added those type of conditional access policies in there, and then I would write some custom policies in MCAS to look for those any activity related to those accounts.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
What was the name of the service that scans the internet for the stolen credentials?
What was the question?
Oh, it's a feature of Azure AD. I can't remember if it's part of the identity protection capability, but it's called leaked credentials. So if you look for Azure AD and leaked credentials, you'll find that feature, and there's quite a bit of documentation on it. And that actually is the sole thing that gets you a high risk on an account.
Yeah, if you look at the Azure Information Protection, in the marketplace, if you pull down the Azure Information Protection, you can see there's a link in the high, medium, or low on what they're doing in there and how to enable the policy and reset the passwords. So.
Thank you.
Yep.
You recommended synchronizing passwords up to Azure AD so that it can be analyzed, but to my knowledge, there are some or a couple of features which need Pasu or ADFS authentication. So will there be a change in the future, or what's your stand on that?
So we don't have any specifics on that. It's to make the decision, and this is something that we probably didn't cover in exactly this right framing, but to make the decision of federated versus synchronized, there's a lot of different things that go into that decision. But if it's just a matter of, hey, we're going to keep it on-prem for security reasons, we want people to understand that there is a security benefit or loss of not synchronizing. And so that was the key point that we're trying to make. We know that there's other considerations when you're making that decision, whether it's pass-through or federation or synchronization. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
So last two questions.
Yeah, hi. Actually, in my company, we are introducing Office 365 right now, and my team is responsible for securing the whole environment, so the tenant and Exchange Online and Office 365 Pro Plus. So actually, your talk was very helpful for me. Thank you for that. But two questions. Actually, I'm asking myself, what about the on-premise side? So when for E3 and E5 license, I have the ability to use Office 365 Pro Plus as on-premise, and I was asking myself, how can I securely configure the on-premise side? Is it still with GPO, so the old way, or are there any new ways? So what are the recommendations for that?
We haven't put out a new Office baseline in quite some time. I know it's an active conversation right now internally on that. I know there's some challenges around it, and I don't know the nature of those challenges.
The separate password feature when you enable MFA, for example, would be the only one I can think of right now.
Yeah, and I mean the big one that from a pure attack standpoint that comes to mind that I would be most focused on is about 6 months ago they released a refinement to the macro protections that allows you to use a much more logical both enables productivity while also enabling security a refinement to it. I don't remember the exact nature of it, but it actually made restricting macros much more usable than it had in the past. That's the biggest thing I would worry about making sure was on. The defaults themselves are a pretty good configuration. You can also look at the last Office baselines that we released and kind of see if those can be applied and if those make sense. Unfortunately, we just don't have any current baselines for Office.
Okay, so are there new baselines coming, or?
I know there's a discussion, but I don't know if there's any commitment to make them happen.
And will there be some difference between the on-premise configuration and the online versions? Do you know?
I wouldn't expect that there would be. I mean, there might be some minor ones, but how the client behaves shouldn't change that significantly. But that's a guess on stage while I've got a mic on, so that might not be 100% reliable.
So actually, the way to go right now is via GPOs, right?
Yes. Yeah, GPOs is the mechanism at current. Yes.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Sorry. Yep. And that's it. So thank you guys all very much. Feel free to show up at the stage afterwards. Thank you.